So we have Dan K back, and then also we have his podcast host for 4 years down in Argentina, Fernando. Thanks, Tom, for doing this.
Hello.
Oh yeah,
My pleasure.
fair.
So
What kind of reading did you do to prepare, or note taking? Where are your notes? Did you bring notes?
I'm completely
There
on the
they
same
are.
team.
I told
Oh,
you,
oh my
he's
God!
ready.
Ma-
Oh, this is
ma-
good.
It's empty. That's key.
Uh huh.
Okay,
That's just the one you're showing us.
Yeah.
it's a psyop. Absolutely.
Ah,
So yeah, so when I was talking with Dan K, we were talking about kind of like weird politics and like at least in the U.S. it was Fourth of July recently, and it was funny going to a Fourth of July with like a couple that I'd never met before, and it turned into a conversation about is the Constitution still good? And
mm.
these are like relatively middle of the road people, and I thought that was an interesting color on 2021 that becomes a Fourth of July conversation. So like Fernando, like I mean, because you're living in Argentina, what's as like an Argent as someone living in Argentina, when there's the equivalent of Fourth of July, like what do you think is like the most common feeling people have about the Argentine government?
Well, I can't generalize, but before answering that, I have to ask you, Colin, is that really shocking that people think that the constitution should be changed? It's been known for more than 200 years. It's perfectly normal for a country to change their constitution. The Chileans are doing that right now.
And most people, it's at
I
least
mean, it's
every
200 years
most
old.
people I meet, yeah, and it has not changed meaningfully. I feel like for the whole time I've been alive and the whole time I'm politically conscious in the U.S., the Constitution is more of like a religious document, and the founders are more. It's kind of like a civil religion, and it's not really
It's not
something that can
realistic anymore.
change.
Yeah,
It's
but
not. It's not
it's
working.
not realistic anymore. So it makes sense to at least discuss the possibility of updating. Is the whole thing
So I
with the
mean, if you
Second
thought of it as
Amendment.
like an operating system, right? Would you not update your operating system?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
obviously you would.
It's great, and I think that it engraves in people's minds the fact that you've had a 200-year running democracy nonstop compared to Argentina. That is a good thing, but there are also bad things about this, and it's the fact that you've got a document that was written in the late 18th century, and just like Dan
Hmm.
pointed out, it is perfectly valid to update it. And we've got that process here in South America, not in Argentina, in South America going on
Yeah.
all the time. The Chileans are doing exactly that right now. The constitution that Pinochet, the dictatorship, sanctioned in 1980, which supposedly led to this economic stability that made the Chileans the example of the world, is being changed as we speak, because loads of people that took to the streets 2 years ago were not happy with it. So it made me curious that you were shocked by people wondering if it was valid to change the constitution. But sorry, I didn't answer your
No,
question.
yeah, and it's like in the U.S. context, it's like there's an openness to deep structural change and actually like starting to question those things. I don't think that's ever been true before. I think it took the pandemic and seeing the U.S. fall on its face like every other country, and it removed the idea of American exceptionalism in a pretty deep way.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's like part of it, and I think the other part of it is it's been a really long time since a whole generation of people fought a war against a country or multiple countries that were sort of
Mhm.
objectively evil. So nobody really unified around, a set of principles that
Mhm.
make American exceptionalism something that is realistic to believe in, right? So if you go kick ass like all around the world for 4 years and win against like the evil armada, you know
Mhm.
that's kind of
Legit.
exceptional. It actually is exceptional. But that was 70 years ago. So we have the best economy in the world. Okay, but is it
Mhm.
inclusive of everybody? Does it provide equal opportunity? Like there are definitely improvements to be made. And the generation, my grandmother, who's going to be 96 in less than a month, is the generation that fought World War II. And there's a couple thousand of those people left. They're all in their 90s, you know.
Mhm.
So now with my parents who are boomers, and Colin, your parents are like, are they boomers? They're probably like even
Yeah, but on
Gen.
the lower edge of it. Yeah,
Okay,
like mid 60s.
right? And so they're the people who like started to question the establishment and said, this whole thing is fucked up, and why are we meddling in other people's governments, and we shouldn't be going to war all over the place, and so forth, and without really understanding. I think the evil of communism is a bad phrase because it's like misleading. It's saying that communism in and of itself is sort of intrinsically evil, and it's not intrinsically evil. It's that it produces outcomes that are evil.
Have either of you guys read the book, The People's Republic of Walmart?
No.
It's so
I
it's
know
about
what it
the
is.
idea. Yeah, it's like it's the idea that like we already have a planned economy that works really, really, really well. It's called the purchasing department of Walmart. So if you were to, without doing full communism where you nationalize everything, if you just nationalize Walmart and then you make it so that's kind of the people's store and that's like either at cost or massively subsidized, if you keep the executive bonus structure and kind of keep the management incentives in place, you, would that actually be a bad, like, what's the argument against that? Because I mean, sure, okay, it's communist nationalization, sure, evil communism, but you could probably lower the cost of food and lower the cost of clothing by a hell of a lot, and people would live a better life.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah, but
think
that's
in commerce, if it's goods we're talking about, and not something like, or rather, maybe it's not industry specific. Maybe it's that there is a public-private blend. Like my healthcare best scenario would be bare bones Medicare for everybody, but also a free market for anyone who wants to participate, right? And I think that's kind of what you're proposing is like some sort of baseline where everybody gets a share of what we consider sort of sufficient, right, to live on: clothing, food, shelter, water, something like that. And then everybody else gets to participate in a free market economy. It's not like completely centralized. It's sort of like partially centralized and partially subsidized.
but there are
I think I'm
countries that
for
are
that.
like that. There are several countries that use that model.
What's an
Which
example of that, where you have like a store system, like a grocery system, where it's like
No, no, really. I mean, you've got things that are strongly socialized, and the state has a very active role in guaranteeing certain things. And the rest of the economy operates freely. Scandinavian countries
Mm.
are a good example of this middle of the road, what you call social democracy, and wrongly call socialism in the U.S. Well, the British have a public health system that is a model to the world, and it's a pretty economy-oriented economy in everything else. They destroy unions in the 1970s and 1980s, but they kept Mrs. Thatcher kept the national health system, guaranteeing free health to everybody. Actually, the U.S. is kind of the exception in the world, not having some kind of public health system that is free for everybody. Here in Argentina, we also have a mixed system. I mean, we've got, public hospital, public health. I mean, you walk into a hospital and you get care. And then you've got Obra Social, which is deducted from your payroll and is provided by
assuming
a
you work in
network.
Blanco.
Assuming you work in Blanco, of course, yeah, yeah. But if you don't work in Blanco, you can go to the public hospital. But if you got healthcare, if you got a health plan, be it obra social, which is deducted from your payroll, or you pay for a fully private health plan, such as OSTE, for example, or Swiss Medical, which is top. I mean, it's a elite. If you have any of those and you go to a public hospital, then the public hospital asks you for the information about that, and they deduct that. I mean, it's not that the state is paying for your healthcare if you are already paying for these other two options. So there are, things in between for guaranteeing certain things. And in my opinion, and I believe that it's the opinion of most countries, health is an issue that has to be guaranteed by the state, has to be provided a base something, and this also brings prices down for the I
Massively.
mean, for the private health
Assuming the
systems.
public system can negotiate, right? So our system would be much much cheaper if our Medicare, which is a public system and does insure something like well, Medicare and Medicaid together insure half the country. So if
And
we,
walking into the hospital to the emergency room, I think is another 15%.
yeah, something like that. But I think this is all too vanilla, this conversation. Colin,
Yeah.
what is your
What?
ideal form of government? If you were
Oh.
gonna create the United States over again, or like let's just say you had a landmass that looked like the United States that had a population of roughly 340 million, and you
Mhm.
were gonna set up a government for it, what would you do?
Well, my head would go to, especially you got a continental empire, is that you have the empire layer. Like I think the Byzantines are pretty close.
What?
So you have the empire, yeah, because
Fer,
they
no
have the top
reaction from you.
layer.
Fer, do you need a mate or something? Are you okay?
It's
Did
too
you
late
hear
for
any of
mate.
that?
Yeah,
That'd be pretty
yeah,
cool.
the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, because it's like you want a government at the top layer that is aggressive enough to like destroy all the oncoming hordes and to kind of enforce the borders and do a bunch of really aggressive expansionist battles and at least kind of a losing battle on the way in. And then within it, it's weak enough that you can have awesome city states that are technically part of the empire, but expanding and kind of exploring wildly. I think if you look at something like Venice, you have 200,000 people, you have a city that prospers for 1,000 years, and it existed within the Byzantine Empire for a good 500, 600 of those years. So I think in the context of North America, you want a government that can protect North America in a unified way from the Chinese, from the Russians. But we basically, the United States essentially already controls the Western Hemisphere. So I think like the goal of that imperial government should be maintain the security of the Northern Hemisphere or North America, make sure there can be no other real competition, and then make it so people can experiment wildly within the
isn't that,
system.
but isn't that what Washington, the current government of the U.S. does?
There's almost no experiment. I mean, so I'll say the exception is COVID. COVID was a bit of an experiment on the part of the state government, each of the state governments, but by and large, there's no experimentation at all that goes on in the United States from a political point of view. It's like
Okay.
deadlock across the board. You have
Mm-hmm.
democratic zones, which is like
All right,
city
that kind of
centers, and
experimentation.
the city centers have been
I mean, a
controlled by
political
Democrats.
experimentation does not equal instability. That's what many people crave here, having a stability. People being able to ignore politics, to ignore who's the minister of economy, and be able to live in countries like yours, in which you can afford to ignore politics. Maybe not now, but
Yep.
decades ago, you could afford to be an independent or not voting or not participating or not caring because whoever was in office, the state policies would remain the same. There would be some changes, but not like Argentina, in which a government comes to office and everything changes overnight.
I think it's like I think the issue is that for societies that are in decline, like the United States and also
Yeah,
Argentina,
I
it's
agree.
that the you look around and that stability is really just decline, and you don't have anything to compare it to because there isn't really like even like within the American context, San Francisco has been the high growth area, and it's just filled with like feral homeless and people getting stabbed and like
Shit
carjackings and like
piles, by the way. San
literal piles of
Francisco,
human shit.
San
Mm.
Francisco is actually looking like Buenos Aires, but substitute the dog shit for human shit, and
Yeah.
that's what's going on
Yeah,
in
but
San
I
Francisco.
also heard that living around there, I mean, in the San Francisco Bay Area, is extremely expensive, and you've got all these brains, all these people working for software companies that are crammed eight into a single house because they can't afford to live on their own because it's so expensive. That's not life standards.
Yeah, and like what is it about kind of like the kind of the current Western society, which is that everyone is okay living in this state of degeneracy. Whereas if you just go and you look back at a Florence or a Venice, like you see, yeah, yes, they built their cities over hundreds of years, but there isn't a single example of a modern American city that's actually beautiful or even slightly competitive with Europeans because you don't have any beauty, you don't have anyone doing anything meaningfully cool in creating community because it's very boilerplate. Like there's only three types of city governments that are even allowed in the United States. Like you can't even really experiment. So like even if people do want stability, I feel like a big part of that is that no one has an example of like true radicalism where it's
What
like
do you
there
mean?
isn't a true commune.
Can we double
What's that?
click on three types of city governments that are allowed? What does that mean?
Yeah, there's one. It's like a city. It's a kind of like a council manager where it's like you have a council that then is kind of elected, and then they hire a manager. And the idea is then the manager is a bit more professional and is a little bit more immune to politics. But then you have another, which is that you have like kind of a mayor, and then you have a council, and there's a third one I'm blanking on. But you don't really have any experimentation beyond those three systems. And a lot of states, cities actually have to choose from that menu. They can't create a new form of city government.
So state mandated by and large, or literally across the board in all 50 states, say you're going to establish a city. Here are your choices.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so it's like there's kind of a perception that there is room for innovation and there's a laboratory of states, but when you actually get into it, it's it would be against the Constitution for like one state to be a monarchy or another state to be like like a noble hereditary merchant republic of Bezos or something. So
Hmm.
it's like you wind up being constrained to the point that there's a feeling of freedom and experimentation,
What about
but
the
in
Indian
the actual
reservations?
normal.
What about the Indian reservations? Don't they have the room inside those reservations to make these kinds of? Aren't they sovereign or independent enough to try these experiments?
My understanding is that they are, and then my understanding is also that by plying them with alcohol over centuries, we've reduced their will to live enough that no one's doing anything hopeful besides
Mm,
doing casinos.
yeah.
So we're hunting them to extinction and then giving them the worst land in the world and no education. So like as a defeated people with no birth rate, they're not
But
even
wait,
doing
wait,
enough
wait.
to survive.
We gave them meth recently. I mean, that's got to be a
That's right. Hmm.
step in
That's a
the
step
right,
forward. Hmm.
direction. At least
Yeah.
accelerates the process. God, that's horrible to say. Are we publishing this? Hope not.
Yeah, yeah, right. No, but I mean that really is like the state policy is that there's been like a persistent multi-century campaign of annihilation, and it continues into this day. And yeah, I mean that makes sense from a
So,
civilizational
but how do you
standpoint.
go from where we are now? And I do feel like there is
Yeah,
I wouldn't say groundswell, I wouldn't say uprising, but I would say that there's clearly a lot of people pissed off on both
openness.
sides
Yeah,
in this country. How do you go from where we are now to a place where we could actually experiment and like basically what we're talking about is applying A/B testing to government, which isn't happening at all in any sort of tracked way. Like you could imagine if what if California said we're going to try a flat tax, and New York said we're going to try consumption tax, and other states said we're going to try other things, and then you end up looking at outcomes 5 years or 10 years down the road, and you actually can say, hey, this thing worked better or this thing didn't work. But how do you get from here to there in any sort of because I just see so much inertia and so much corruption, honestly, in
yeah.
both countries, both the U.S. and Argentina. Like I'm so not hopeful for any of this stuff.
Isn't it secession and then eventually military reunification? It's like you have a bunch of rich regions secede, and then over time you have defense agreements, and it plays out over centuries. Like, I mean,
Won't the
is there
rich
a peaceful
go
version?
to like New Zealand first? Because like
I mean,
yes, but in order for that to happen in aggregate, you'd have to have all the rich people kind of talk to each other and say like, yeah, we're going to do this
mhm.
instead of sort of one at a time. On the individual basis, making the decision to buy a ranch in New Zealand or other remote paradise, and flee kind of whenever they want. Because the problem with rich people is they can go wherever they want, whenever they want, and they can protect their money in tax havens, and they're not really beholden to any government.
But that's the ultra rich. I think it's always about the middle upper class are the ones that always drive the revolution, whatever it is, whether that's a secession or whether it's a true revolution. I mean, I guess in the Argentine context, I mean, the performance of the Argentine government has been so awful for over 100 years. It's bizarre to me that it hasn't broken up yet, or there hasn't at least been some kind of. Well, I guess there was a dirty war, and I guess I mean, but was that secession oriented, or was it a revolution within the existing borders?
What, the dirty war?
Yeah, the dirty war when there was an
No,
insurrection. Is
no,
that was
no,
the
no.
goal like
No.
a communist overthrow or to
No,
split apart the country?
the dirty war is the term used outside Argentina to refer to the methods used by the dictatorship. One,
Mhm.
the last today dictatorship between 1976 and 83,
Yeah.
against their rivals. Some of them were guerrillas, left-leaning guerrillas,
Hmm.
Marxists and Peronistas, but most were union leaders, workers, intellectuals. I mean, they
No, no, no.
didn't want these people.
The question, Fed, is why did they
I
decide
mean,
to
but
overthrow the government?
who? The
The
junta?
military.
The,
Yeah.
those gorillas. Yeah.
No, the guerrillas did not overthrow the government. It's the military that overthrew the previous government
Oh,
in
sure. I just mean
76.
kind of the guerrillas that are fighting against the military government. I mean, what did they have a goal that was outside the context of this federal Argentine set of borders? Because I feel like there's just a lot of it's there's still a lot of confidence in the idea of Argentina with its current borders, where it seems like those borders haven't worked yet, and it seems like everyone's still within the frame. And I'm wondering if there's been any kind of major movement with Argentina where someone is just saying that Argentina doesn't work.
Oh yeah, loads of people. I mean, people have been saying that for ages, and especially through these past 5 years, there's a growing feeling of disillusionment with the country. And a part of the media is informing every day about throngs of people leaving the country because they lost hope. And yes, it's been an issue all the time, and I can agree to a certain extent with the idea that the Argentine state as a country has not worked, has failed, and is already a failure. But it never ceases to fall. It never ends up collapsing, and we are in constant crisis, and that, from a certain point of view, is not entirely a bad thing compared to other Latin American countries that seem so stable, but in reality, beneath the surface, they are boiling up until they blow up in the worst possible way. In Argentina, you've got protests every single day. People don't wait a minute to take to the streets and claim for whatever they think is right, be it higher salaries, lower taxes, more social plans. I've got no electricity. I mean, we want abortion, whatever you want. You take to the streets immediately, and it seems that the country is in constant turmoil. It is, but this constant turmoil prevents an explosion, a revolution that changes everything from one day to the other. That's a theory. I mean, I'm not saying it's not going to happen soon, but I've been wondering why it hasn't happened so far. How are we still alive? How are we still here? And
the other
well,
part of the explanation, I think, and this is actually true globally, is that by and large, excluding, let's say, the bottom 10% of countries where starvation is really an issue, an ongoing issue for, let's say, greater than 50% or greater than some number, 30%, 40% of the population, where people are actually starving to death, is where you will find revolution. And you say, like, take the 1917 revolution. People were starving to death in the whole country. Like 95% of them were starving to death all the time for years. Their parents were starving to death. Their kids were starving to death. Everyone was starving to death. Okay, fuck it. Let's grab the pitchforks and let's go kill some motherfuckers, right? But in Argentina, even though it's like 50% inflation, like my brother-in-law drives a truck,
we never got there. We never got
he
there.
makes ends meet, and there, I'm sure there are people who are starving, but it's like 5%, 10%, and there are programs for that help those people so that
Always, I mean, band-aids, patches all the time. I mean,
right, but it's enough. It's a strong enough band-aid so that people don't take to the streets en masse and murder the leaders.
Is there an argument that it's like there's the resource curse in Africa where you have just so many resources that people are going to be constantly fighting over the extraction of these things? You can't build a reasonable civil government. Okay. Is there like an agriculture curse where like somewhere like Argentina, which India has the same problem, is that it's so fertile, you can grow a lot of food really, really, really easily. And so just by virtue of the geography, it's hard to screw up so bad that people are actually having a famine. Like I wonder if Argentina having one of the best, most strategic geographies on the planet actually like dooms it in a way because the geography makes it so incompetence that in most geographies would lead to mass famine is just, maybe like there's not a lot of chicken, but there's still plenty of beef.
I mean, the macro dominates the micro any day of the week.
Yeah.
Like that's the answer, right? So if you look at that on an industry basis, like if I'm advising a 22-year-old recent college graduate on what to do with his or her life, assuming it's a his or her or your or G's life.
Oh, really? You've got inclusive. You're having inclusive language in the U.S. Sure. What's the term?
Zer.
Oh,
I think it's pronounced G or
African.
Yeah. The advice is, well, pick the fastest growing industries, right? And then pick the fastest growing company within that industry, right? And that's the horse you want to bet on. And it sort of applies to countries too. Like Bolivia fucked constantly. Like, what do you have? Nothing. I mean, maybe there's a couple minerals there. I don't remember, but you have like half the country's jungle, and you got nothing. You got no port to speak of, and the rest of it is high plains desert. You got some salt. Don't think that's very valuable.
Gas. They've got gas, natural gas also.
Natural gas. Okay.
Natural,
but they don't have the infrastructure to extract it or export it, right?
No, not really. But they've been doing a lot better over the past 20 years. A lot. I mean, even in macroeconomic terms. When we were under Macri, supposedly a pro-business, free market government, in certain indexes, according to international consultancies, Bolivia was better rated than Argentina. Bolivia under Evo Morales, a socialist, an indigenous left-leaning leader, and Bolivia looked stronger to investors than Argentina at that point.
I mean, part of it's also like the timescales are also very warped in the entire hemisphere. Like thinking about Rome, where you have a bunch of refugees from the Trojan War who got their ass kicked, and then they're building a city for 300 years before anyone hears about them again. And like in North America and South America, like the Western United States only really meaningfully started 130, 150 years ago. And I feel like the Western United States and like Latin America, at least in like South America, with like the modern countries and the modern nation states, run roughly the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean the Western U.S. is even potentially younger than that. I mean, Oregon and California became states in the late 1800s, but that only means that they had like a couple thousand people living there, right? And yeah, they established a government. But I think to your point, it's interesting that the role that technology plays in all of this. No government system that is currently being used ever contemplated the level of technology that we have today. And I think that's the fundamental flaw. I don't think, and I don't have a solution for that, but I do think that we need serious political reforms in order to unlock a lot more value from what people are willing to contribute and do if you sort of leave them alone and stop forcing them to conform, especially in places like school. Mm-hmm. Like school is a huge problem in my mind. I watch my kids go to school. I'm like, what are you learning? There's a couple skills. There's a couple core skills that they're working on: reading, math, writing, that are essential for communication. That's all required. But then I'm like, what about the subject matter that you're learning, especially as you pass? My kids only just finished second grade, so they're going into third grade, but you wonder when they hit sixth grade, seventh grade. And now we're actually getting into subject matter where there's half the day that's going to be spent instead of practicing a skill because you need the skill to acquire the subject matter. You're now just acquiring the subject matter because you already have the skill. Well, what are the subjects that we want our kids to acquire? Because those are going to be the subjects that the world should care about in the 21st century. And it's like, when does anybody ever talk about technology in up through 12th grade? Right? When does anybody talk about finance? When does anyone talk about time management, relationship management, job prospecting, taxes? By the way, why don't we teach people how to comply with civil authority, like the police, so we avoid issues like Black Lives Matter?
If everyone had like a set of ritual around traffic stops and kind of, it's like there's a literally, and like plenty of societies have had this in history where you have like a ritualized greeting, you have a ritualized response, and you just maintain the ritual throughout the entire thing and no one gets shot.
Totally. It should be super formal and everyone should be taught it like once a year or once a quarter in elementary school and in high school. If you're ever stopped by the police, this is exactly what you're supposed to do, because then everybody knows what the standard is. And if you deviate from the standard, you're fucked. Understandably.
Yeah. No, for sure. And going back to
what do you mean that people don't know how to behave? Sorry, but what do you mean, Dan, that people do not know? They need to be taught at school how to behave with the police. I mean, you're under arrest. I mean, freeze. There is not a lot to learn, right? I don't understand.
And then people start walking towards them, or they run, or they move their hands around, or they reach for their, or they're like, oh, I should get my insurance papers out from the glove box, and it looks like they're reaching for a gun.
Those things.
Okay.
But those things are never made explicit. Nobody ever, the reason I know what to do, when I'm stopped by a police officer in my car is because my mom and my dad, when I was getting my driver's license when I was 16 years old, they said, if you're ever stopped by the cops, you turn off your motor, you roll down your windows, and you put your hands on the wheel. You be really nice, and you don't tell them anything, right? But that's the other thing. People are not told that in the United States, the cops are allowed to lie to you to extract information.
Which means they're encouraged to.
They're encouraged to lie to you to extract information. You can't, if you're a police officer, you can say, well, but I saw you across the street looking in that house's windows. So what were you doing over there? Right? Wait, what? Right? What do you got in the glove compartment? What do you got in the trunk? Why were you signaling to change lanes? What's the baseball bat in your back seat for? It's like, what? Those are things that we don't teach. So, like, by virtue of not explicitly addressing how society is supposed to work, by going over things like what is the Bill of Rights, what does that mean in terms of practice, what you can say and not say in a court of law to a police officer, what you should say and shouldn't say in a court of law to a police officer, how you can enforce, write, and revoke a contract, all those sorts of, none of those things are taught. Right? And it's like, that is the fundamental fabric. Like, once Karlin and I were both entrepreneurs, Karlin still is an entrepreneur, and the hard knocks of being an entrepreneur means you send your first contract to somebody, and then a year later it blows up, and you're like, oh fuck, why'd that blow up? Oh, because I'm the one who wrote it, like with my friend who's a lawyer on his, in his spare time, and Karlin's laughing because he's sure he probably did this just like I did.
Totally.
And it's like, you learn the hard way because you get fucked at the end of it. Well, why don't
you
we
get shot? You just get fucked.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's in that scenario, because that's a civil matter, but in a criminal matter, you could get shot. So it's like, why don't we address the things that are the fundamental building blocks of how society runs as a matter of education, and the fundamental growth areas for the economy, specifically technology, as a way to educate our whole society, instead of doing things like reading the classics. Not that Fed and Karlin, I know you guys are both fans of the classics, so not to knock.
No. I agree. I mean, I don't think that the classics are necessary. A lot of the things that I was taught at school, that my kids are taught at school, I think are useful at all. I think that by far, in a country like Argentina, the number one topic that kids should learn, or at least my personal goal for my two kids to accomplish when they finish grammar school, is that they are able to speak English quite fluently. Yes. Period. Yep. I don't care about anything else, because that's the key, the skill they need to acquire more knowledge and more subjects.
They're guaranteed to have 5 times higher income if they speak English fluently.
Absolutely. I mean, it's my case. I've been having jobs in Argentina since I returned from living abroad for the last 15 years, only because I am able to speak some English.
Because it's also,
I love how you said some. That's great.
Yeah.
I didn't want to say because I can speak English well. I didn't want to
speak English so well.
I still, you got your line.
It's also like, it's at the extreme where it's someone has to be like a almost self-loathing level of nationalism to not learn to speak English fluently, given like, if you at all care about your children and your lineage and like the skills and the ability to learn, to not have speaking English fluently be priority 0 for anyone learning up not speak English. I mean, it's an indicator of incompetence, because in any field, there's no way to become an expert in that field without speaking English fluently. Like, how do you even converse with the experts? I mean, is there any field where someone could actually be in the top 5% of their field without speaking?
Not possible.
No.
Everybody who's because the world is international right now.
Yeah.
And so everybody who is an international expert by definition has to speak English, and I think there's very few exceptions. I would volunteer to say that probably if there are world-class experts who are French, they're the ones who are less likely to speak English. Maybe the Chinese as well, but the French especially, because of the pride. It's like, okay,
I don't think that applies anymore. I don't think that applies anymore.
Maybe
for French. No, but forget about the experts or the top 5.
Right?
forget about the top five or the elites. For anyone, I mean, there are so many. I mean, I love this digital age. That I mean, this is a new. Definitely, we have left behind the contemporary age of history, and we are in. It still has no official name, but it's a new age. This possibility that what we are doing right now, this interview with video. I mean, when we were growing up, not even growing up, when I was going to the academy, the broadcasting academy, you know what the first test I had in computer? Send an email. That was the test. Sending an email to the teacher. That was the year 1999 in Argentina. And look what we're doing now, only 20 years later. You were comparing timelines or time scales, and well, this is 20 years. It's insane. And this is a digital age that offers a lot of very good things. I'm surprised that there are still free applications, tutorials, all kinds of things. And the 80% of that is in English. I mean, you're missing on that if you don't speak English. Just go on Wikipedia. It's got 5 times more articles in English. So, from my perspective, the number one priority for children going to grammar school is learning English, and then we can see what they want to do when they go to high school or university, whatever. But number one is that, not the classics or math or learning to. I mean, last year during the pandemic, my kid, was in fourth grade, was supposed to swear the flag. It's a tradition. When you are, I think you've got something similar over there in the U.S.
Yeah, daily
And,
ritual.
and some parents were scandalized. I mean, we missed this because the school did nothing to offer an online option of this, and they didn't encourage patriotic values or love to the flag. And I thought I was dealing with parents my age, 40 something, and it sounded like people in their 80s that they had that priority. I was surprised.
Well, I think it's that there's a failure of the English speaking global elite to navigate the fact that we're now part of a single linguistic, technological skill social network. And like anyone that's not part of this global social network, which is speak English, is inherently pretty incompetent because it's so hard to be competent without speaking. At the same time, that's a direct assault on national cultures all over the world. So it's I feel like there's a push almost everywhere to abandon any sense of positive nationalism, and this is as true with the American elite as any other country. And they kind of have this idea that the top 5%, the top 10%, that kind of professional managerial elite is essentially one global community and one global group with one set of global interests. And so, you're a fascist if you're doing a salute to the flag, but then the bottom 70% still maintain their patriotism because their lives have not changed that meaningfully over the past 20 years, except in negative.
Probably yes. You're right. I think that national cultures are a thing of the past. I mean, we're still thinking in 20th century terms. With
Yeah,
this
so
digital
like that's
age,
one of
we
my
are
big
we are
big beefs with
moving towards
countries in general. Colin, you and I
atomization.
talked about this. Didn't we talk about how we're in a post national world? From my view,
Yeah, no, yeah, expand on that.
yeah. So like, it doesn't make any sense. Like the whole concept of immigration is I think immigration is a desirable illegal immigration specifically,
Mhm.
but even to an extent, a lot of legal immigration is a desirable thing to have. One, because the standard of living in the destination country is better than the origin country, but also a huge part of it is the person who can leave the family will send money back to the family in origin country,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Adding a massive advantage on the exchange rate, right?
Yep.
So you don't have to make hardly any money by, let's say, U.S. standards. You could make 40 grand a year by U.S. standards, and if you're able to ship 10 grand of that over to your family in, Dominican Republic or wherever, they're all of a sudden have a full salary. It's as if you're working there, right? Or even more so, right? And so it's like if you remove borders, like who is fighting a territory war right now? Like an
I
actual
mean,
geographic territory war.
certainly Russia with Ukraine, and then also what's going on in Ethiopia is definitely like a two front border
Yeah,
war.
plenty of border
But
disputes.
it's
Yeah,
it's
India,
super
Pakistan.
limited, super limited compared
Morocco.
to what it was a generation ago. and then that is super limited
absolutely.
compared to what it was a generation before that. Like if you go from World War II to today, it's like border wars have almost effectively ceased, right? So it's like, why do we have borders?
In Andrew Carnegie's autobiography, in the last chapter, in about 1908, he made the same argument that in this new incredible age of globalization and prosperity, obviously war is a thing of the past. World War One was a little bit of a surprise.
Not the can.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think though that having passed through that and having seen a period of, so like Steven Pinker's book on I don't remember the title of it, but all the sort of trends in the right direction, right? Like poverty going down, death from war going down, number of wars going down, women's rights going up, education going up, literacy going up, global GDP per capita going up. And by the way, if you look at the graph of global GDP over time, it looks something like this: like year 0, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 16, 17, 1,800, 1,900, 2,000. It hasn't even moved by the year 2000, and then all of a sudden in 2000 it goes like this, straight up.
But I mean, those are all numbers as outputted by an autistic global AI optimizing for economic output. It's at the same time you could be mapping the suicide rate per capita, the level of despair, the amount of like 22-year-old virgins, and you have the exact same trend. So it's like when you're ripping out the community, when you're ripping out the sense of place, when you're ripping out a sense of purpose and destiny. Like, yeah, it's like, okay, so it's like literacy rates going up. I mean, if you're living in a medieval village, your quality of life is so much better than even being the average American.
Yes.
You're much happier. 100%. Like, so first off, I mean, like you have a sense of purpose. You're married when you're about 14. You have an apprentice where you're learning great skills. You're able to not just feed your family, but your community. You're going to church and God is real in your life on a daily basis. And just
a much simpler life, a much simpler, easier life also.
So,
obviously, if you compare that to the standards of today, applying those standards of medieval village to the 21st century can go. I mean, it doesn't work because history moves forward. It's not static. So we are analyzing models and systems that worked in the past, but they can't be applied anymore. Or maybe there is some kind of. Who are we to say that? In 100 years, in 200 years, we are not in a new paradigm in which democracy is totally outdated and nobody discusses that it didn't work. I remember having a
predict. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it's not even a taboo anymore. People are discussing it without being called fascist. But I mean, it's the way of the world. I mean, the world has evolved from monarchies in which nobody discussed the thing that some people were born to rule by divine rights, and some people were born to obey. That is not the paradigm anymore in the world, as we all know. But maybe there is a new paradigm in a couple of centuries, in 5 centuries, and maybe there is I remember discussing with you, Dan, once that you said that on paper, the best possible way of ruling a society is a benevolent dictatorship. That was your term. A benevolent dictatorship, not a dictatorship that kills people. A dictatorship that is appreciated by everybody. Nobody seems to believe that they're doing anything wrong. I mean, that goes against the very concept of democracy that we have now. But maybe in 500 years, human societies evolve to a point in which we have reached a balance in which we know everybody what's best for our society, and there is no more need for.
Maybe the benevolent dictator is like, we build the AI correctly, and that's what ends up happening.
Or you vote on the objective, right? It's like, as a people, you vote on the objective for like, what are you going to try to accomplish? What are you going to try to move the needle on? And then the autistic AI optimizes for that.
So, but I want to go back to this question of a medieval serf is better off than. Who are we picking in modern, like in today's culture? Who are we picking? Like,
he said, an average American.
An average American.
Someone who's it's like kind of like someone who's grown up in somewhere in kind of like a medium-sized town in Ohio, 2 kids, 2 parents.
But wasn't there like imminent threat of death all the time in a medieval culture? Like, couldn't you just be killed whenever, wherever? Like, there was no law.
by
There
by
was.
but okay, but I mean, like, but I think it's like, so technically, sure, in the same way that a Roman father could technically, he had the power of life and death over his family. But I
Mhm.
think everyone in Roman society agreed that a father who killed his kid is kind of a dick. And if he suddenly kills his wife, you're not inviting him to a dinner party anymore. And that actually works pretty well as a matter of, preventing homicide. Similarly, if you have someone who is a medieval lord and they're casually killing their serfs who owe, I mean, which is a relationship that goes both directions. Like, that lord has like responsibilities to that serf. That serf has responsibilities to that lord. That a casual murder for no reason breaks that contract in a fundamental way, and he's not being invited to nice parties anymore.
Hmm. Were serfs invited to lots of nice parties? Is that like sort of a?
No, but I mean, you have to
Uh,
factor in. You have to factor in happiness and the sense of purpose, which
mhm,
Colin pointed out. I mean, what is the point of living 80 years if you are totally worried and stressed and you can't sleep well and you have in your mind that you owe something all the time and you are constantly unhappy and you have to take pills to
mhm,
sleep, to have sex, to eat, to whatever. Wouldn't you take a 45-year life in which you have a simple life, you eat every day, you go to church, and you have a sense of purpose? And if you go and take a poll, you travel
mhm,
back in time, and you go to a medieval village, and you start asking people in the street, in the market, are you happy? And you go to Ohio, and you go to the mall, and you ask the same question, you'd be surprised. You're gonna find a higher percentage of happy people in the medieval village.
Okay, so
People
number
thinking
one,
themselves.
are you saying we should all go to church?
That's not what I'm saying. But probably. I mean, if I
Your
lived,
mouth to God's ears,
if
right?
I had, I mean, in the Middle Ages, it was practically illegal to be an atheist, so I didn't have an option. I would have gone to church if I lived in a
But
medieval
are you
age
saying
because
that
I'm an
that
average
produces
person.
happiness? Are you saying that
Eh?
that produces happiness? Because I kind
No,
of
I'm not.
agree with that
No,
argument.
no. I'm not.
sure.
No,
Obviously,
I'm
right?
not saying. I'm saying that. I'm just talking about factoring in the comparison, the sense of purpose that Colin mentioned, and
Hmm.
happiness. Not only material things that you quantize, like people living longer, or having
So
more meals,
I never mentioned that.
or having
You
more
guys,
stuff.
so and I never mentioned that either. And I agree that those are irrelevant to happiness. But I think that the that homeostasis really is the governing equation for human beings. So you're always going to be, even if you are sort of constantly under threat, you adjust, the human adjusts to the level of threat that is constantly being perceived, right?
Hmm.
And adrenaline levels level out to some sort of normal daily level that might be higher than the average, let's say today, because we're not under constant threat, but there's like a standard daily operation that anyone would go through no matter where you put them, right?
Hmm.
So like it's abrupt changes in um, it's abrupt changes in your environment that cause you to be depressed all of a sudden. So job loss for men is a huge thing, right? And ongoing job loss for a man, especially of sort of marital age or reproductive age, is a huge ongoing status problem, right? If
Oh,
you're unable to provide as a man, like you're fucked. You're not going to get a woman. Full stop, right? So is it better to be so and the other thing I wonder is like on a percentage basis, like yes, suicides have doubled in the last, I don't know, year, 2 years, something like that. But I wonder on aggregate, like how many people who actually felt sort of uh, stable, let's say, because I think happiness
hmm,
is a really misleading word.
sure. Yeah.
Felt stable, in a medieval culture versus feel stable today. And I would argue that the percentages are probably nearly the same. Just that today everybody lives longer and doesn't have to do as much manual labor.
Well, but I think the difference is that it's that it's so interesting. You read about how globalized the Roman world was in the 300s. Emperor Julian is kind of going from France on campaigning against the Germans, and then he's off to Anatolia to kind of be going on a war there. And it's just the amount of travel that the elite was doing back then, and the amount of interconnected grain shipments just to feed the city of Rome was incredible. And then you teleport, 1,000 years forward, and it's so it would have shocked that elite, but the life of the average person under medieval Europe was infinitely superior to people under the Roman system, who were being treated as subject people and being completely extracted from, whereas someone who was a serf would be able, I think it was either 30 or 50% of the food they produced was for them and their family, which is at what percentage of the wealth and IP that you create for a technology company as an employee that goes to you and your family so that you can allocate it for your community. Oh wait, it's zero. And then you think about how is it that we go from this present society to something in the future where it's something a little bit more similar to where it was in those medieval ages, where I think it's like you have cities like Venice where the really prosperous and ambitious people can go, and it's a couple 100,000 people, high performers. I think we lost Fernando. So you take those, and then 90% of the planet is living in almost a situation where they're able to farm, they're able to have a good sense of that world seems a lot better. You're able to provide not just for the elite, but for every single person.
So do we? So let me understand you. Like, don't we provide for, like, we have far lower sort of quote unquote poverty and famine rates than we ever have had in human history before today. Correct?
For sure.
So I think that what I'm saying is that the positive emotion that a person might feel because they know that their status is relative to average better is only ever relative to average. And by virtue of raising the average, you don't make
Right.
everybody feel better. It's just that the bar has been raised for everybody. And now, instead of, a GD, oh shit, Feder's drinking. Who knows where this is going to go? Mazel tov.
Hit it.
Oh, Colin's on here. He's on. We got him. Well, well. So I was saying, Fair, that I think it's just a question of relative wealth, right? So if we raise the average overall, how do we know that anyone actually feels better about that stuff? Because like if you take poverty today and you compare it to rich 150 years, like you compare it to Cornelius Vanderbilt, like Cornelius Vanderbilt never had indoor plumbing, right? And so you're like, well, did he feel shitty about having to use a chamber pot, or
Yeah, and I feel like it's like you take that to the extreme, and I think that it's almost the thing that was so interesting with the medieval world was that it had such a bifurcated system where you're either part of this kind of land and farming and strict hierarchy system, or you are part of this kind of merchant city system, and there's almost no overlap between those two systems, and the people be in those two systems almost never even.
Sorry,
Because in the Cornelius.
I'm telling Fair that we can hear him, and he obviously can't hear us.
Oh yeah, I can't hear him, so it died from my end. I think he might need to just refresh.
Oh, you can't, Fair. You can hear me, but he can't. He can't see or hear you, Colin.
Oh, interesting.
But he can see and hear me for some reason.
Yeah, I think he needs to. I think yeah, Fernando. I think you need to refresh there.
So sorry, that kind of derailed the conversation there. What can you make that point again?
Yeah, so I think the best way of making that point would be that one of the obsessions with kind of modern democracies is the idea that everyone should be part of the same system, which I think is kind of deeply fucked up for everyone involved.
So that means everybody should be part of democracy. Meaning, when you say system, you mean democracy, or you just mean any system?
Any system. So it's like you think about in San Francisco, in kind of a very modern Western sense, you have two systems side by side. You have people that are in an economic elite that are earning massive money in the tech industry, and they're paying out the ass on rent, and then they're living side by side with people that are homeless and people that are just scraping by, that are in like brutally repressive economic and financial situation. And these two people are walking by and seeing each other on a day-to-day basis. And the idea in the West is generally, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, America's just becoming like more like Brazil, like every single year so far. And like instead of becoming more Latin American, I think the question is, can you try to have systems which are, it's like the people that are living in Florence don't need to be living next to the people that are living in the slums. It's actively offensive to the people in the slums to be walking through to Florence on a day-to-day basis. It's better to raise the bar of the two different systems in the two different societies and have them interact economically in almost prescribed ritualistic.
uh, isn't so like here's my I think this follows.
Yeah.
I think that the baseline for us is skewed. I think that since World War II, there's been this unbelievable technological and a lot of times specific to infrastructure boom
Yeah.
since World War II, where there was all this infrastructure built that was totally revolutionary and amazing. The interstate, the grid, all this sort of stuff, right? The
Yep.
internet, and wages went like this in the United States until like 1971, and then they
Mhm.
plateaued, and they went up so fast, right, that we thought that there was this thing that we could maintain called a middle class,
Mhm.
and in reality, it was a fluke of that era of technological innovation. And in reality, everything reverts to a Pareto distribution.
Well, but
Does that
Pareto
make sense?
distribution made worse by technology.
Right. And so to
We're,
me, the
I
question
think
is like,
I think you make a good argument that like that the internet and technology is shifting the Pareto distribution by a digit.
right, right. And so my question is it reasonable to expect anything except a Pareto distribution? Right.
So you're better off
So
just like not rubbing it in people's faces.
So if it's not reasonable to expect anything but that, I wonder why even people like us, kind of get trapped in this question of like, what's better? I think there's only like what's not going to result in utter dictatorial brutality, right?
I think it's giving a sense of inevitability with outcomes that makes it less terrifying. Because I mean, one of the advantages of like you have like a noble merchant I said noble merchant houses like in Venice, and one of the things is if you're born into a shitty situation, you understand why. You weren't born into the nobility. It's a very straightforward explanation. When you lose your job because a giant multinational decided to do 10% across the board layoffs and your boss didn't manage to get an exception to that in the staff meeting because he was a little bit hungover, but then the boss in the next section over was able to get an exception for his people, and now you're unemployed. You're living under a mortal threat on a day-to-day basis in an unfeeling, uncaring system that's much scarier than living in somewhere ruled by like hereditary privilege.
So that's really interesting. So I don't know if I disagree with that. I just wonder like what do you do to modify our system, cuz like in Argentina, like so my wife who is Argentine who worked in HR for several the last 4 or 5 years is like workers have no rights in the United States. None. In fact, the reason why you see so Oh yeah, and it's true. Colin, do you agree?
Absolutely zero. I mean,
No rights.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You can be fired at any time.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
and the branding is amazing. It's called a right to work because of course they spent like $10 million on branding efforts, right? Well,
Mhm.
but it's not the right to unionize; it's the right to work.
Uh,
But I mean, but I mean, that's the whole. Is that like just the unions in the American context just don't have the wattage to compete with the branding from the top and the polling efforts from the multinationals. Like
mhm.
they just can't keep up on a messaging standpoint, and they get their ass kicked.
Increasingly not true.
Because
No,
you
no,
can de-skill
I said
if you
increasingly.
successfully de-skill the role.
Yeah, increasingly. Not it's not true now. It's
Yeah.
increasingly not true over time.
Mm-mm. No, I disagree.
Ooh.
Yeah, no,
Ooh.
yeah, because I mean, these companies have successfully de-skilled these jobs so that if you were working on a factory line 60 years ago, there's actually skill involved in that job, and there's some knowledge, and you kind of understand there's like some quirks of this machine, and you're bringing some institutional knowledge to the role. In what Amazon and McDonald's do brilliantly is they break down these roles into such minor, tiny little pieces that you can be trained by a robot to do it, monitored by a robot on the quality of your work, and then replaced by algorithm. And no one will even notice that you're gone because an algorithm hires someone else. There's a lot of articles about how Amazon hired something like 300,000 people last year, and they did that almost entirely algorithmically. They don't even have someone to interview most of these.
Oh, Colin, we can't hear you, or I can't hear you. Fer, can you hear
Oh, I
Colin?
got muted. Now it's back.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So no, I mean, there's people. There were not people involved in the hiring. There are not people involved in the firing. And when someone gets disappeared by the algorithm, no one notices.
Nice way to tie it all together.
Right? Because at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, it's just like it's like what like the optimal algorithm for something like that would probably just do random firings.
Yeah, and it also like it kind of surprises me right now that fast food still employs humans. I'm like, why hasn't this all been automated at this point? Like, I guess that there are a couple key steps, like constructing the burger, right? Like, I think putting the burger down, timing it, flipping it, that's all automatable. But I think that getting the fries into the fry container and getting the burger constructed, bun, whatever, patty, cheese, whatever, bun, and then into the packaging, I think those still require human fingers. And I think that's why you still have, so like the dexterity of a robot really, hmm yeah. No, there is unemployment insurance. Well, see, I think
During the pandemic, what's that?
No, go ahead.
During the pandemic, Amazon introduced a great new workers benefit, which was unpaid sick leave. So you were actually allowed to take unpaid time off and not lose your job.
That's actually really smart.
Unpaid,
It's kind of
unpaid
like
time off.
one of those nefarious, evil benefits. Like if you can pay rent with your credit card, like that's
Exactly.
yeah. So I actually think that the race for talent, the arms race for talent, stay over there. The arms race for talent is going to accelerate, but only among the top X percent, 5% of knowledge workers. Right?
Yeah.
Every multinational is going to compete over the people who have deep technical skills and cross functional knowledge and quantitative reasoning abilities and communication abilities to be able to sort of build these algorithms.
Which is only like 15-20% of the population.
Oh, I think it's even less. I think 5% of all workers. Yeah.
Well,
It's the
it
direction of
does with a
travel.
sufficient police state.
It's not today. It's the direction
Yeah.
of travel, and because like again, if you look at like robotics is way behind software. People confuse the two, but robotics is the physical movement and manipulation of the physical world by a machine, right? So robotics is way behind software in terms of being able to automate tasks. You just now have things like automatic drink makers at airports that can serve you like a mixed drink, like a cocktail, which is all that is just liquids coming in and then a hand handing you the cup, right? But if you think about the burger question, or even some food that's more complex than that, or some other process that's more complex than that, it's like, how do you automate that away? Well, it's being automated away on a daily basis. Like, that's what's happening. So that's the interesting question, I think. So that's when you go back to our question about what's the appropriate system of governance, or what's the appropriate way to reallocate resources, redistribute wealth, however you want to describe that concept. And that's where I think the question is interesting. And sort of universal basic income or some equivalent, I think, has to end up being what happens, because how are you going to employ, like, there's the really interesting stat to me that came out of COVID is like, okay, tons of people lost their jobs, right?
Yep.
Tons of people got furloughed, and now we're out of COVID, basically, right?
Yep.
And people still don't want to go back to work. There's still a job short. There's still a labor shortage. There's more
Because
jobs.
we shipped UBI.
What's that?
We shipped UBI. It's just
You
called
think-
a
you think
bonus
we should-
on unemployment.
Kinda.
Yeah.
Colin, you want to fill him in on the
Yeah, so I mean, what happened in the U.S. was that when there was like the mass furloughs, when there was the sudden lockdown, despite lockdown's a whole separate thing. So, but like in the U.S. context, there was a law passed to make it so everyone got an extra $600 a week on unemployment, which for most people was as much as doubling their income if you're working at minimum wage, sometimes more, and that would last basically indefinitely. And then they extended that. I think it went to a $400 a week bonus. Now it's like 200, and there's no end in sight now.
Yes.
So
yes.
so the way that we shipped UBI is that we've now started doing stimulus checks every 6 months or so for about $1,000, and then that lets everyone kind of go out and party a little bit and feel like your life still has some amount of hope and meaning. And then on a weekly basis, there's a 200, 400 for the unemployed. So we've just special classed the people that had a job at the beginning of at the beginning of COVID as essentially being in a class above the people that were unemployed before COVID. Those people now have essentially some hereditary rights as non-workers, where they're now special class compared to the other unemployed.
Votes, votes.
Yeah. And one of the things that was so interesting with Trump is like kind of Trump was the most effective Democratic left wing leader in since FDR in the United States. Like Trump was able to pass a massive stimulus that went out to everyone. He managed to pass one of the greatest expansion in unemployment benefits in American history, and he did all of that. Well, but it's not because the Republicans did not want to do that. It was the MAGA nationalist populist right wing that wanted to do that, and Trump told Mitch McConnell where to suck it because he got him a Supreme Court justice. So there's a very left wing economic faction within the American Republican Party now that's now completely taken over. And that's why I think one of the things that's really interesting going on in the US right now is that Trump shifted the Democratic Party way to the left of the Democratic Party on trade, where now the Republicans are much more left wing on trade. They're much more left wing on immigration. They're much more left wing on economics. And so that leaves the Democrats, they're doing a bunch of social justice stuff, but they're not really left wing in any economics. So now in the US context, again, as these things are going, the American left has decisively won most of the issues around trade and also kind of unemployment and minimum income. And now everyone's just competing on who gets to take
a week.
Yep, a week.
Yeah, but see that's still $2,400 a month in the States. What they were making before a minimum wage. What is that? 30 grand a year, roughly. That's especially in a large city. That's poverty.
Well, except that a lot of people also moved in with their parents, and the U.S. is kind of undergoing a shift to kind of more Indian style generational housing, and so that isn't tenable in a household where no one works, but in a household where there's at least one man or one woman who's working, if you add everyone's unemployment together, that starts to look like a meaningful amount of money. So it's a deep restructuring where there's a structural underclass that's being legislated right now, and
mm-hmm. and to your point, Fair, like once you roll out that, this is the thing that makes sort of any sort of systematic extension so difficult to decide on, because once you grant any new extension of the operating system, rolling it back is nearly impossible. It just never happens. So like the only way I think, going back to our revolution question, the way I think that you modify or reform any of this stuff is through a full restart. So like I think Mars, like Mars is kind of the answer. Like once we colonize, it's like, I wonder what the government's going to look like on Mars. You know what I mean? Because, and also like who is because Elon Musk is going to go first, does he get to choose? Like who gets to choose what the government is on Mars, and who gets to own?
I think Elon would argue he does.
I don't know if he would argue that. I think he would say that's an interesting question.
He would say that's an interesting question as he, increasingly takes over the best land with a series of small bases. So, it's kind of like imagine you were coming from Mars to Earth, and you were going to be establishing a series of 100 or 500 person colonies, and you're able to survey it from space. Like, if you just took the American West Coast, the American East Coast, the area around Chicago, the kind of the land around Argentina with the Rio de la Plata, maybe like the Ganges Valley in India, and then Italy and some spots around the Mediterranean, maybe Japan, Sydney. You're good to go. Like it's like 8 or 9 colonies. If you can do an orbital survey first, you can let everyone take the scraps. You've just taken 80% of the planetary GDP because you have the high ground on what's the territory people are going to want over the long run.
I just tweeted Elon. We'll see if he replies. You guys could like it or +1 it or something if you want to try to get him to retweet it.
Amplification.
Give it a little amp. Like all 17 of our followers.
But I think it's like what's going to go on in the U.S. is the same thing happened with England. Is that the English elite migrated their wealth and their capital and their bloodlines to North America and gave up on England as it started to become more socialist, and they just relocated their wealth and they moved their money and they moved their gold to North America. And I think we're just going to see the same thing play out. Is like as the U.S. does more social programs, 19 in the World War One. Yep, because yeah, you see the writing on the wall. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because once you have the first one, once you have the very first one established, you can kind of see what the directionality is going to be.
Yeah, that's the problem. Going back to our original point on the rich, that's the problem with the rich. They're always just going to go wherever the most favorable situation is because they can. So there's always going to be tax as long as there are sovereign governments that are tiny and have nothing else to produce except for tax haven status.
Yeah,
there are going to be tax havens. Unless the U.S. goes in with military force and says "fuck you," we're taking back our tax money, which I would kind of be for.
That'd be the best use of the military since the Spanish-American War.
Jesus Christ, absolutely. Do you know how much money there is offshore right now, estimated? Either of you?
It's got to be trillions. Is it tens of trillions?
Try 30 to 40 trillion.
Fuck. Just American wealth?
Well, yeah, just American. But that's not just individual money. That's also multinational money. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Unpack that.
Plants also scream when you kill them. Plants also scream when you kill them.
Oh, pour one out.
Just because you can't hear it doesn't mean it isn't happening.
But isn't it right? It's just a different wavelength. That's what the real tic tacs are. The plants are getting their revenge on us. I think it's like that's why environmentalism is just imperialism dressed up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're an actual environmentalist, yeah,
yeah, we're gonna figure out. Yeah, we're gonna figure out how to grow meat in a lab. I mean, we already know how to grow meat in a lab. It's just a matter of being able to scale it and make it, sort of a little bit more consumer friendly. Look how fucking fast we manufactured these vaccines, right? Now, like, I'm highly dubious on the efficacy of these vaccines. I'm vaccinated just for
safety. Oh yeah, I'm not. God no.
Oh really? So let's.
Fuck no. What was that, Dad?
No, I want to hear your explanation. Why not?
Oh, it's an experimental medical treatment, and my demographic has a 0.02% case fatality rate. So it's a nothing burger. No, I'm not going to take an experimental shot. And I'd like to have some kids in the next few years.
Burger.
Yeah,
hamburger menu top left says nothing.
Right. I just think it'd be good to make sure we're not living in the Children of Men prequel before taking it. So I think that's one. Yeah. I think number two is everyone's. I remember looking at kind of the Wuhan stuff back January 2020, and it was like, okay, like how long is this going to last for things to get back to normal? And it's like, okay, like 2.5, 3 years. And then I was talking to someone, they're like, no, it's going to be 3 months. I'm like, can you do math? Let's run through this in Excel.
Give me a break,
So the thing is, now that this is out, most of the world doesn't have the technological infrastructure to end the pandemic anytime in the next 40 or 50 years. If you're going to have a vaccine that needs to be kept at negative 200 Fahrenheit, like the list of countries that are technically capable of that is vanishingly small. So based on that, this thing is going to continue evolving in a bunch of places where the elite have access to marginal vaccines at about 60% efficacy against variants. So at some point over the next 10 years, there's going to be a variant of this that's actually scary, that I actually need to worry about, that I actually need to take an emergency vaccine treatment for. But I think the issue is that by someone in a healthy demographic who does COVID impact? COVID kills old people and fat people. I'm not fat and I'm not old. So at some point, it'll impact people that are young and not fat. So at that point, I'll need to take one of these. But everyone that's healthy and young that's taking a vaccine right now is really opting into taking a vaccine every 6 to 12 months, regardless of whether an individual variant is actually dangerous.
Yeah, in my case, I didn't want to take it because of the tracking that's embedded in the
that's vaccine. True. Yeah, Bill Gates getting us down to 500 million people. And
Did you get vaccinated, Fed?
Did you?
Yeah, I got vaccinated. The reason I got vaccinated because I'm going to be traveling internationally all the time, and there's just
Yep.
I don't see a future where it's going to be easy to do so without the vaccination proof. So just went and did it.
Yeah.
Also,
I
I,
mean, is
I
it?
look at the risk of like I was really on the fence, and I was really really resistant for the same reasons that you articulated, Colin. It's like, why am I doing this when I essentially have no risk here, and it's like, well, I think the signaling, like, by and large, I will be living in a community. The probability is I'll be living in a community where everybody else thinks it's a good idea to be vaccinated. And if I'm the only guy who isn't vaccinated, then there are social repercussions.
Oh no, that's the one good reason I think for to get vaccinated is that it's really trashy and lower class to not get vaccinated. So the only reason I would get vaccinated is for social signaling.
Well, he lives in North Carolina, so he doesn't care.
And I'm going to move to Texas. So.
Although people in Austin are probably getting vaccinated, not
Oh yeah,
people outside of
but I don't wear a mask. I just say I got Moderna.
Yeah, I'm with you, Colin. I don't trust it. There is all this paperwork, by the way, that you have to sign before you get it that says,
Hmm.
this isn't FDA approved. This didn't go through proper clinical trial.
Hmm.
This isn't proven. Blah 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 blah. And it's like, and you listen to some scientists and some doctors, and they're saying it's fine. It should be north of
Hmm.
95% efficacy if you get two shots. Maybe stay away from one of them. I can't remember which one it was. And I'm like, you know what? Like, throw up my arms and like do it. Fuck it.
Yep.
You know, because at least I'll be able to travel without trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aspartame, baby. Multiple daily injections of aspartame.
I mean, it's interesting how dangerous it's. Yeah, and it's also like the doctors were also saying it's safer. That what hasn't happened before.
Global pandemic.
Oh, it did in 1957.
Well, Spanish
Yeah,
flu,
1957.
1918, same thing. Yeah, but there's been one major one every 100 years or so for since. Yeah, as we get more and more population dense, we're more and more prone to this issue, especially the more interconnected we are. Yeah. Well, what it is that the Chinese are trying to destabilize the American economy. That's what's going on.
I mean, I think it's pretty likely. Well, clearly, right? I mean, we're all on the same page. Came out of a lab, right?
100%.
100%.
You mean the Wuhan coronavirus lab? Is that the lab you're talking about?
Really gonna go out on a ledge here.
I wonder. Not so much the
Um,
Ebola lab, not so much the
Quite a
cancer lab, but
coincidence,
really
yeah.
the coronavirus lab. That's the one I'm
Hmm.
concerned about.
Where they started removing staff members who also happened to be hospitalized early on in the pandemic. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Quite a coincidence. Um, no, but I mean, like it's shocking that that it didn't happen earlier. But I think it also it goes to your point about like how does this all unwind? And most countries don't have a reserve currency. Like the most of the world isn't going to be able to survive the amount of debt that they just printed. And I do wonder if that is kind of one of the in game elements for Latin America is that if there's you have you have some of the global warming elements, you have some of the droughts, like the United States right now is having one of the worst droughts in 50 years. You have that in a couple places. You constrain the food supply. You have massive debt. You have the capital markets start to shrink up at the same time that the boomers are retiring en masse and starting to withdraw from their savings instead of investing. So the cost of capital is about to skyrocket, and that looks scary. Well,
Oh,
I think it does. I think it looks great for kids. Not for everyone's kids, but yours. Yeah,
stop it,
that's not
sinner.
cool. Sin.
Wrong, 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 wrong.
Just do a little Viagra in the fake meat, and everyone will be straight.
Yeah, no. Give me the meat and give me the pills.
Well,
Hmm.
but I think it's optimistic. It's pessimistic writ large. But I mean, I can't wait to have kids. I want to have a fuck ton of them because I think the thing is that like there's no reason not to be hyper optimistic for being able to raise kids in this kind of knowledge economy, right? So it's like when have a kid turns 13 or 14, buy up an app for them to run that costs like 10, 25,000, and instead of an allowance, and let them run it. There's no reason to go to high school. You might as well just start working and doing cool shit. Like there's more opportunity that's going on, and in these periods of dislocation like we're talking about, that's like those are, if you have the mindset for it, those are the times when families and bloodlines move up the most. That's when families fall, and that's when families rise, and that's when everything gets mixed up. It's the past period when things are static. This is the time when there's opportunity. It's a game time. So like as soon as like the stock market starts crashing, that's when I'm rock hard, because that's when it's actually like the game actually starts, and we're living in like one of the only times in history where there's a real opportunity to move up.
You don't have the last name for it though. Rise of the Plamondons
No,
doesn't really
it
roll
doesn't.
off
It's
the
more.
tongue.
That sounds like a dead dinosaur.
Yeah, right. You could. Does kind of sound like a dinosaur. You could take Justine's last name.
Yeah, right.
Rise of the
No, but I
Harringtons.
feel like it would just be the rise of the Harringtons.
That has a ring to it. It's a
That
stronger
does.
sort of English. That's an English name, isn't it? Probably.
It is. Yeah. Though I feel like there's like something just kind of like name all the kids after like Roman emperors and stuff, and
Yes,
just gonna wrap
Julius
it out.
Harrington.
Yes, Julian Augustus, power name. What do you guys think? I mean, like, are you? I mean, when are you worried for your kid in terms of the future? I mean, to me, it just looks like it's all upside and kind of people kind of in our kind of age bracket. I'm around 33. You guys are in your 40s. Like, I feel like the kids are going to graduate into 10, 20 years from now, an amazing economy and an amazing opportunity.
I wonder. I don't worry about my kids specifically. I wonder how to. It's more like I wonder about the appropriate levels and processes that I'm instilling. Right, like how much reading should I ask them to do per day? How much extracurricular sports and music should I ask them? Like, how can I make sure that they're not resentful of the things that I ask them to do, because I know that it'll instill the value of sort of practice in order to develop skill, um, because skill acquisition is going to be the one thing that they have to learn to be able to do any of the stuff that you talked about. And so if they learn that, then yes, the possibilities are sort of endless. But if they don't, and I fuck them up, not impossible. Of course, a lot of stuff that I've read and heard, like Jordan Peterson talking about, and a guest that Sam Harris has had on his podcast, some anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist talking about the effect of education on life outcomes, and it turns out it's almost zero. It's like 1% of your life outcome is your education. It's something like 30% IQ, which is genetically determined, and another 10% conscientiousness, which is basically work ethic, which is largely genetically determined. And so it's like you're kind of born with the set that you got, and the parents' largest area of influence is over peer groups. So where you live and the other kids that you choose to associate your kids with, which is like where they go to school and what sports they play and what activities they do and where they vacation and all those sorts of things, are the things that are going to drive their behaviors. Because if you surround them with a bunch of other hardworking kids who are focused on, achieving skill mastery and goals, then they're going to be focused on ski. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but those are all like, but like you go through that, and like those are not end times considerations. Those are the considerations of a parent in Babylon or Rome or Constantinople or any other time, right? It's there's nothing about the end times in.
I don't follow.
I just mean it's kind of like we're talking about kind of like that we're about to go into this period of great dislocation, and there's going to be all these crises in all these areas, and like all of the things that you're kind of talking about are the normal concerns of any parent in any time in human history.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah,
And I don't know if I don't know if I agree. We're about to go into a period of great dislocation. I don't think that it's going to be abrupt. I think it's already begun. It began, at the beginning of time. And it's going to follow its natural progression. And we are on an accelerated path compared to what it was, let's say, pre-widely distributed internet. But I was reading a tweet on some VC the other day. It's like we're at the absolute infancy of things like e-commerce and the penetration of technology into society. The absolute infancy. So it's gonna accelerate. But I don't imagine that, like, tomorrow or one day to the next, all the truck drivers are going to lose their jobs because Tesla comes out with a semi truck that's self-driving. That'll happen over time, and maybe first Tesla's going to announce it, and then they're going to have a contract, and then there's going to be some workers who lose their jobs, and then there's going to be another contract, and so on and so forth. And it never happens like that. It always happens one step at a time, a tranche at a time, a sector at a time, a contract at a time, and it'll give, that's where I would hope that people like Andrew Yang end up getting into office, who are like forward thinking and numbers driven, and saying like, how do we best flex to solve these issues as truck drivers lose their jobs, because they will. And scene. Well, maybe there's certainly a responsibility on the part of corporations. Maybe I think any corporation, like if you want to have a well-functioning society and you don't want to have people rioting in the streets all the time, and you don't want to have a true revolution where everything gets reset to zero, you must redistribute wealth. You must. You have to.
Totally.
And so the only question is who has to redistribute, and then how much, right? And so it's like
and do you still
the
have
fact that
political
so
rights
many
of a citizen? Oh, sorry.
Right. Well, it's so many. It's so like when you say technocrat, what do you mean?
Yes.
There's a small human next to you. Hola, Teo.
No, we can hope so, right? Because I mean, you look at someone like Lee Kuan Yew, who's able to turn Singapore from a shithole set of rice paddies into a prosperous city state.
I was just going to bring up Singapore.
Yeah. And I think a big part of the issue is that we're ruled in most countries by high school class presidents, not people that have any competence at all, except for kind of like smiling and waving effect. So in America, who are the best people to be running things? Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. You can go down the list of the richest people. They're probably the ones that should be running everything, but we don't have a system of government that takes the most competent people and gives them power. I would tend to think that a big part of the problem. Yes. I would tend to think that one of the biggest problems is that Mussolini discredited corporatism, which is such a fertile design space. So you think about what kind of the fascist Italy parliament was. It was technically going to be about a third artists, a third for businesses, and a third for elected representatives. And of course, Mussolini was just kind of a spazzy sex addict, so he just took all the power for himself and made all the decisions. But on paper, that makes so much more sense than anything we have, right? So it's if you were to take something that looks more like that parliamentary setup, where you're actually having mechanisms through which, Amazon, instead of bribing politicians through lobbying, actually just has a seat in the government. But then they're also having to work alongside unions and work alongside artists. I would think that would make a lot more sense than having people like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama.
Yeah, in our system, some of the fixes are so obvious and are such low hanging fruit. Why don't you have term limits for Supreme Court justices? That doesn't make any sense. You should have one term. It should be long, 10 years, 15 years. I don't know what the number is, but one long term. Same for senators, one long term. Same for presidents, one long term. So guess what? You eliminate re-election from the equation, because everyone who complains about government is like, oh, politicians care about getting elected and getting re-elected. Well, you can remove the re-election part pretty easily, right? The election part, okay, well, as long as we're electing people, you can't remove that. If that's the system, then that's the system. Yeah, and every country that has re-elections has the same problem. And it's in order to create flexibility in government, you should eliminate re-elections, and then you should pick arbitrarily. There's always going to be arbitrary long terms. Maybe president gets 6 or 7 years. Maybe Senate gets 10 or
40.
11. Maybe Supreme Court gets 15. Something like this. But to have House of Representatives members who have 2-year terms, how are they not just constantly campaigning? How is that not constantly what their life is? Right? When are they actually governing and thinking about issues and thinking about what's best, not for just the constituents who elected them, but also for the country at large, because they're making decisions not just for their own district. It's fucking asinine, man.
Well, but that's not really true. I mean, the American system had a civil war after 100 years. Compare that to the Venetians, where it's hereditary. I mean, all these systems that we agree upon haven't lasted more than 150 years. In any case, I mean, it's a pretty bad track record.
Going to church is a ritual.
Totally. No,
you brought it up. I didn't bring it up. You brought it up. See how he just takes bait so easily?
That's how we all became Mormons.
Right? Oh, all right, fellas. It's been real. It's been a
Let's
pleasure.
figure it. Yeah,
It's time to go.
it's late there.
Let us know when you post it, Colin. I appreciate
Absolutely,
you
we'll do.
organizing and recording.
Thanks for doing this. This was super fun. We appreciate it, guys.
All right, guys. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.